must put an end to the evil Shredder. Now go, my sons.
Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles! Turtles counted on 1, 2, 3, 4. Turtles! Mutant chain reaction. Turtles! Living underground. Turtles! Ninjutsu action. Turtles! It's a shell of a town.
In 2005, Konami released the final installment in their TMNT trilogy, Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles 3 Mutant Nightmare. Taking place during the cartoon's third season, the Turtles try to put an end to Shredder from global domination. Taking cues from what worked and what didn't work with TMNT 2 Battle Nexus, Mutant Nightmare looks to fix many of the gripes the second game had. However, does it truly fix those issues? Or is this game just a nightmare to play? Let's find out. The story for TMNT 3 Mutant Nightmare takes place over 3 episodes, combining various episodes of the third season. Episode 1 has you facing off against the Triceraton threat in New York City and fighting alongside Traximus. Episode 2 has you facing off against Bishop and his creations. And Episode 3 has you making your way towards Shredder for one final battle. The story is told similar to the previous games, where there's a cartoon cutscene prior and after missions, but mixes it up with 3D rendered cutscenes that are voiced over this time around. It does a serviceable job of connecting the missions together and getting the feel of completing an episode altogether. It does feel less connected than Battle Nexus' story though, and really just feels like separate storylines in each episode. However, once you complete all 3 episodes, there will be one final episode. TMNT 3 Mutant Nightmare actually returns to its beat-em-up roots this time around and fixes many of the questionable design decisions from its predecessor. This time around, all 4 turtles are always on screen, with the AI taking control of the turtles that are not in play. Each turtle has their own dedicated health bar this time too. Controls have taken a big step forward in which they are far more responsive this time around, and there's not really any lag input. They've also added more combos to mix up the turtles' moveset. You have your weak and strong attacks, but now there are more unlockable moves where you do full combos not only with the weak attack, but strong attacks too. You can also mix up the buttons for different combos depending on the moveset of that turtle. It's a vast improvement in the controls department compared to Battle Nexus. Shurikens do return, and depending on the scroll equipped, you can change the element of the shuriken, but more on scrolls in a bit. Blocking returns in this game, and now you can dodge by pushing the analog stick while blocking. However, they removed the dashing mechanic from the first 2 games, which I don't understand why, as that made movement far more enjoyable. There is now a lock-on button, so if you aren't facing the enemy but decide to still attack, your turtle will start attacking towards that direction. They changed up how to do team attacks this time around too. Holding down the block button, you can press either the weak attack or strong attack button when your Ogi gauge is full, which is located right under your health bar. Doing so will bring up a prompt that has the next turtle enter the D-pad commands, which they must do while holding down the block button as well. Once all 4 turtles do this, they will unleash an attack that will decimate enemies or do serious damage to bosses. You can also use this gauge and do a special solo attack by holding down the block button and pressing the shuriken button. Leo unleashes a wave of blades, Raph does a lunging torpedo, Mikey throws mini tornadoes, and Donnie does a 360 spin attack followed by a slam down with his staff. Now, it should be noted that you can only do these special attacks and team attacks when you've locked onto an enemy. Scrolls play a big part in the game's mechanics. Each of the turtles can equip various scrolls acquired throughout the game. These scrolls will bump up the turtle's stats, such as health, attack, auto heal, different types of shurikens, and eventually ultimate versions of the turtles that basically make them Akuma-style turtles with the glowing kanji symbols on their back shell. I really like the idea of the scrolls actually, as it gave the game a slightly more action RPG feel to it. Also, throughout the game's campaign, you will earn crystals for defeating enemies. Crystals can be used to actually purchase new skills and scrolls to further improve the combat style of your turtles, such as more elaborate combos. So, TMNT 3 Mutant Nightmare refines quite a bit in the combat and controls department, but what about the other gameplay mechanics? Well, it completely ditches the platforming aspects of its predecessor, so levels are more of a traditional beat-em-up affair. Levels are a bit more open at times where you will transition to different areas. Some missions will have you destroying certain objects to complete the level, to protecting allies, to escort missions, to even the traditional get from point A to point B pummeling enemies. There are even vehicle segments that return in this, whether using a hoverboard to jump off of cars and attack enemies, driving a motorcycle in a wasteland, and hang glider sections as well. Unlike the predecessor with its vehicle missions, these ones actually give you a health bar. Also, there are turret segments where you'll utilize a turret on rails to blast enemies away. There are also segments where the turtles are on rails and throw infinite shurikens at the foes that are trying to attack you. During the shuriken rail sequences, you can throw shurikens and also block incoming attacks. During the turret sequences, you can fire weak shots or charge shots at enemies, but cannot block during these scenes. Aside from the campaign, there are a few other modes. First off, there's a free battle mode, which basically serves as side missions. There's no objective here other than to try and earn as many crystals as possible that you can utilize for upgrading if you find yourself having trouble in later missions. There's also a challenge mode where you can either tackle a score attack or time attack mission, and depending on your overall score, you can earn new scrolls and other items for your main game. There is also a movie player where you can collect DVDs in the game to watch cartoon segments with certain characters. Lastly, there is the TMNT 4 Turtles in Time arcade game that can be unlocked after beating the game's first episode. Now, in the previous installment, I mentioned that the TMNT 1989 arcade game was a very underwhelming port, mostly due to the complete removal of the original audio with significantly worse audio and repetitive. So, did they do Turtles in Time right for this one? Not quite. First off, the soundtrack was removed and actually replaced with the DS version soundtrack for TMNT 3 Mutant Nightmare. Now, I have the DS version of the game and actually love that version, and the soundtrack for it was great. So, while the original soundtrack of Turtles in Time was removed, the replaced tracks are actually good enough to play alongside to. However, they made a different issue in this one that I felt was worse. The original 60 frames per second smooth gameplay of the arcade original and SNES port has now been halved to 30 frames per second. Actually, you know what? I have no words on this one. I honestly cannot understand how Konami keeps messing up these ports. So, I've mentioned quite a bit about Mutant Nightmare so far, and more or less sounds like it's better than Battle Nexus so far. However, there's still some aspects that don't jive with me in Mutant Nightmare. First off, while the game fixed so many of the issues Battle Nexus had, the overall game is fairly boring at times. Some of the levels are a few minutes, and others can be closer to 10 minutes and felt inconsistent. The mission structure also felt less inspired. Some missions tend to artificially lengthen themselves by constant back and forth exploration, and each time going into a room adds enemies that must be defeated to advance. However, it feels a bit more drawn out in this one than in the previous games. Also, the vehicle segments aren't as fun as the ones found in Battle Nexus. While the ones in Battle Nexus weren't great, they were still entertaining to play. The segments in this game just feel less entertaining. Especially these turret sequences and shuriken sequences that are, well, these are just plain boring. During the hang glider segments, I had a tendency to get dizzy as all the screen does is spin in circles until you reach the bottom. It's like playing a flight sim and only spinning in circles for minutes on end. Next is the camera. While the camera can be controlled in this one, I didn't like that the lock-on didn't apply to the camera as well. Because of this, I still found myself constantly moving the camera to see where the enemy or boss was on screen so that I could actually see what I was hitting. Also, the level designs were fairly uninspired and repetitive at times. Some of the indoor corridor missions were dull and lacked a sense of proper direction. Lastly, unlike TMNT 2 Battle Nexus where you can swap between any turtle at any time, Mutant Nightmare has you only controlling the turtle you select at the main menu. While this is more in line with the first game, actually seeing the other turtles on screen and not being able to switch to them on the fly is jarring. You can switch them in between missions, but again, if I see them on screen, I definitely want to be able to switch between them on the fly. In terms of visuals, TMNT 3 Mutant Nightmare is a nicer looking game than its predecessor. It tries to go back to the more cel-shaded nature of the first game, but the game does still run at 30 frames per second as opposed to the first game's 60 frames per second. Texture work is definitely sharper and combat animations are far smoother than Battle Nexus's. Environments look okay, but can be a bit repetitive looking. One of the visual aspects I thought was neat was when you complete a hang glider mission. When done being dizzied, I liked seeing the turtles turn upward and show you where they were going as the mission completes. The 3D animated cutscenes are animated okay, but I did miss seeing more of the animated sequences that had both segments from the cartoon and the newly drawn segments by Konami. Instead, Konami still used the cartoon segments, but sometimes segued to the 3D animated sequences, and it felt like it lost some of the visual charm this way. Overall, the game looks pretty good and was definitely a step up from Battle Nexus. Audio is pretty solid overall, with good sound effects in use and excellent voice acting as usual from the Turtles cast. The soundtrack, on the other hand, is the weakest in this installment than the previous games, and I personally feel that heavily detracted from the overall experience for me. Outside of a few standout tracks which are utilized throughout the video review here, the majority of the game's soundtrack feels really generic. Soundtrack is such an essential part of a game's immersion to me, and unfortunately, most of the soundtrack here is just okay at best. Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles 3 Mutant Nightmare is the wrap-up to the saga, and a suitable one overall. While it doesn't do everything perfectly, and in some ways still misses the mark in certain areas, the overall game is more refined than its predecessor, and can still be an entertaining game at times. Mutant Nightmare is far from a nightmare, but it still feels like it's lacking in some ways. While it is an improvement in several ways, it doesn't fully stick the landing. Now, this doesn't fully wrap up TMNT Month just yet, as there is still one more TMNT game to go based on this 2003 cartoon series, TMNT Mutant Melee. While it did technically release before the third installment, I wanted to save that spin-off for last, so get ready to tune in next week for that review. If you enjoyed the review, be sure to hit that like button and comment. Also, be sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell so you don't miss any future GameCube content posted on the channel. I try to put out weekly GameCube content every Sunday. I hope you all enjoyed, and I'll catch you in the next review to wrap up TMNT Month.